I'd like to welcome you to this two-part online event, Shining Light on Death, and to welcome our speakers, Mike Gartland and Sarah Eagger. So what I'd like to do is to invite you to start with a moment of silence, a minute, and I'll just tell you when that's over. So I'd just like to mention that this event is being organized by the Janki Foundation for Spirituality in Healthcare, and it is a UK-based charity which encourages research and awareness in the field of spirituality and health. I just want to share a little bit about the Shining Light on Death series. So this was something which was organized and started by the Janki Foundation in 2018, was the first one in London. And the Shining Light on Death is really concerned with spiritual aspects of care, the role of acceptance, kindness, humility, and compassion, as well as consideration and respect for the sense of the sacred. So by the end of the two events, today's and next Saturday's, we hope that you will have explored a range of responses of how COVID-19 has impacted on people's lives, challenges, and methods to cope in the presence of someone who is dying. So our two speakers today, they're going to share from their own personal experience, but specifically looking at how this has affected people. I have the website for the Janki Foundation. So if you're interested in visiting the website, there's a whole load of resources. And if you look under the past events, you will find a lot of recordings and summaries of the Shining Light on Death in particular, and upcoming events also that we are having. So please visit the website and browse through and give us your feedback. So thank you for that. I'd like to carry on now and introduce our first speaker, Reverend Mike Gartland. And Mike is an analytical psychotherapist who leads an NHS multi-faith chaplaincy team in West Yorkshire. I have the privilege of working with Mike in the pastoral and spiritual care department. So I'm really pleased that you can be with us today, Mike. So thank you very much. Mike has also have a wide involvement in interfaith dialogue and in leading contemplative retreats. So we have run this Shining Light on Death event in the NHS Trust, where we were looking at exploring death and dying, the spiritual implications of that. And Mike gave his views. So Mike, thank you for being with us, and over to you to share with us for about 15 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good to be here. And I'm starting with a poem, I think.
Yes, that'll be great. Thank you.
Okay. It's a lovely poem by the American poet Mary Oliver, who actually moved on from this life about a year ago. A wonderful soul who had a tremendous connection with the natural world, with the spiritual world, but expressed it in ways that could really sort of speak to people in our time. And this is one of her better known poems, When Death Comes. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me, and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence, and each body a lion of courage, and something precious to the earth. When it's all over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's all over, I don't want to wonder if I've made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I want to end up simply, I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Now, I think that's a wonderful poem, and it seems very appropriate, really, in what we're attempting to do, to use the medium of poetry as very much a part of it. And I mean, what we are doing is actually something quite concentrated. When we've run these events before, I think there were 2 last year, you know, they were over a day, a much longer period, or half a day anyway, and people had greater opportunity to contribute and share their own poems and whatever, you know, may have come up for them. But we don't have that space. But it allows me to say something, I think, about poetry and about what it is that we are in the territory of talking about when we're talking about death, because, you know, human language isn't very good at talking about the deepest things about life, and death is deeper than the deepest things about life. But we tend to think of poetry and music as the ways in which the inexpressible can find expression. And you know, poetry, you think of poems that have made a deep impression on yourself over your life. But I mean, if I were to think of, you know, the ones perhaps we all know, things like Wordsworth's poetry, Daffodils, Intimations of Immortality, you know, poems that actually put into words thoughts and feelings that we perhaps cannot access ourselves. And that's, I think, one of the functions of great art and of great poetry, to be able to express the inexpressible. But when we're thinking about death, it seems to me that we do need to draw upon those sorts of languages to be able to, you know, talk about these things. And one of the other languages is that of myth. And I've been thinking quite a lot recently, as I've been doing a little bit of work on the imaginal realm. A lot of interest in this area over the last 2 or 3 decades. It stems, I think, from the work of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, the great psychologist, in about 1913, after he'd broken from Freud, had what came close to being a breakdown. And for 4 years, he spent a long time alone, and he composed, or began to compose, what was only published a few years ago, known as his Red Book, which is a great sort of journey through the unconscious mind using poetry, image, all sorts of expressive ways of talking about realms of what it is to be human that generally we're not aware of. And I think one of the things that came out of that for him was a recognition that for many people in the world we live in, the Western world, the old myths, we all need to make sense of life, to steer a course through life by. Somehow we're failing, or do fail, to connect with people. What are the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives and about our eternal destinies? And when you think about it, I think, you know, have we been dazzled by a scientific, technological culture? Have we, whatever it is, but something seems to have put those sorts of considerations, that way of thinking, to one side. And you know, when Jung discovered this, when he discovered that those old religious stories, that the old ways of religion didn't work for him anymore, he cried out, you know, where are you, my soul? And then he, you know, one of his more well-known books, A Modern Man in Search of a Soul. So when we get into this terrain, I think, of talking about, you know, thinking about death, and we will have opportunity to say a little more when talking to Sarah about, you know, the particularities, I think, of what the COVID epidemic has really thrown up. But in a way, it's heightened, I think, things that have been sort of under the surface for a long time. You know, we've been very good at avoiding talking about death. Some sort of delusion about immortality, of eternal youth. And even the whole rituals and processes that surround death have tended to become rather, you know, trimmed down, hidden away. We've moved away from the great mourning rituals of the Victorians, the idea of, you know, wearing an armband for a year, to let people know, people aware that we were going through a process of mourning and so on, and needed special consideration. All of these things we seem to have, you know, lost sight of. And but what are the myths? I mean, I think, you know, if we're talking about, and if we were going to do this as a sort of group exercise, well, now I think I'd be wanting to say, well, what are the myths? What are the stories that you hold dear, that help you make sense of your life and your journeying? I don't know if you just want to reflect on that for a moment. And obviously we're not going to be able to go into that in any depth, but, you know, what is that story? And it's a story about the soul. It's a story about my onward journeying or not. I mean, there are people who would say that no, they don't believe in the immortality of the soul and so on. But what is it? What is fundamentally the story that I tell myself? And, you know, it's in those situations of real challenge when we find ourselves really backs against the wall, whatever it may be, personal illness, it may be some situation at work, it can be betrayal, it can be the breakdown of relationship, whatever it may be. It's at those points, I think, that the story that we tell ourselves about life becomes so significant in the way that we deal with whatever it is that we're having to deal with. You know, I've often quoted, you know, when I've been training, supposedly, I mean, so many things seems to be credited to Einstein that one has to be careful about these things, but he said there was one fundamental question that we all had to find an answer to, and on the answer to that question, everything else hung. And the question was simply, do I believe this universe is indifferent to me? Do I believe the universe is hostile towards me? Or do I believe the universe is fundamentally on my side? And you can substitute God for the universe. Do I believe there is a God who's on my side, or there are whole divine energies that are on my side, however you express that? But you can see that those three positions and the way I sit towards them is going to fundamentally change my way of making sense of reality. Because if I believe the universe is fundamentally on my side, if I do believe that through meditation and through prayer, I have access to hidden energies that can be transformative and that can illuminate my path, that can, you know, make a huge difference to the way that I negotiate hardship and difficulty and so on. I'm in a very different situation from someone who believes it's a dog-eat-dog universe and there's no ultimate meaning and so on. So, you know, these stories, I mean, myth is not meant in any pejorative way. When I use the word myth, it's recognizing that myth, like poetry, is a language, and myth is a way of talking about the deepest things, the deepest structures of consciousness, the things that are most profound about what it is to be a human being. Not to be taken as literal history or anything like that, but as articulating something of profound depth and value in terms of helping us negotiate our lives and our deepest experiences. I'd also wanted to quote, and it's not a poem, but it's poetic. It's by another poet, and it's by Thomas Merton. And of all the people, maybe of the last, I don't know, since the mid-1950s, I guess, more than anyone, Thomas Merton has been credited with the recovery in the Western Church, anyway, of the contemplative tradition. Something that was lost for several hundred years, really, but now increasingly, you know, being found at a much more ordinary level, shall we say, than the monastic world. He was someone who had a great sort of understanding of myth, great understanding. He wrote poetry, but a mystic, we would say as well, someone of great spiritual experience and stature. And this is a quote that I found very helpful in my, if like, my mythology, my narrative, making sense of who I am and who other people are. And it comes from one of his later works called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion. A point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, from which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness and of absolute poverty is the pure glory of God in us. It is, so to speak, his name written in us as our poverty, as our indigence, as our dependence. It's like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody, and if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. I've no program for this seeing, it's only given, but the gate of heaven is everywhere. I think I'll leave it there, and that's all right with you.
Yes, thank you, Mike. So I'd just like to ask you to just reflect for a moment on what you've heard from Mike. And I quite like that image of the diamond with all points of light. So if you would like to maybe use that image and visualize your light shining out into the darkness of the world and removing it. So just a moment. Thank you, everyone. So I'd like to invite our next speaker, and Dr. Sarah Eagger, who is the chair of the Janki Foundation. And a little bit about Sarah. She's worked about 30 years in the NHS as a consultant psychiatrist, and has also been an honorary senior clinical lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine at Imperial College in London. Sarah has also worked in the private practice for over 15 years. She has been past chair of the Spirituality Special Interest Group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the National Spirituality and Mental Health Forum, and with the British Holistic Medical Association. So she's very well connected, and also has a lot to share. And recently she has been certified as a mindfulness self-compassion teacher and an advocate of value-based approach to healthcare. And I can say from experience in my interactions with her, she's really one that embraces love, peace, positivity, compassion, and benefit whenever she interacts with anyone. So Sarah, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for being with us. And if you'd like to share your bit for about 15 minutes. So over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nirmala, and thanks, Mike, for your thoughts. It's interesting today. I was just reflecting on my own journey as a doctor, as a medical practitioner, and really the whole question of death. We didn't really talk about it that much when I was training. I remember second year anatomy when we were sort of given a dead body. It was a bit of a shock, and but somehow you grew used to this rather strange environment, and my own spiritual journey and the effect that that's had on really the way I practice medicine, and also my experiences of people dying. And I guess I've always had the question, because of my interest in spirituality, and that are medical and nursing healthcare workers experienced in dealing with the emotional and spiritual issues that are involved in end-of-life experiences. And I think it's better than it was, and certainly a lot more's been written about it, but my sense is that it's still as you said, it's a bit of the elephant in the room. We're all going to die, and we know that, and yet somehow we're avoiding really facing that. And a study by Dignity in Dying came up with a statistic that over 30% of people in Britain one of their greatest fears is dying alone. So there's that whole question of, planning for our own death and how we are with others who are dying, which I think will be the topic of the workshops next week, which should be very interesting. And about half of us will die in hospital. And I think hospices and palliative care, and even now palliative care at home, is much better geared for people having that kind of passing that they planned for or they want, with the people around them they want. But in hospital, and now with COVID, where things happen so quickly, and now really with healthcare professionals having to have played the role of the carers who of the loved ones, because the carers are the only ones present and the family hasn't been able to be there. I think it's been quite a shock for people to have to really be present in that way. And that whole question of how are you present when someone is passing. So really this sense of, are we preparing people for their own death? Are we, even as doctors and healthcare practitioners, do we talk about it and give them time to get their head around it and organize it and have it the way they want to? And it seems that there is quite a lot of suffering really caused in more formal healthcare settings when patients' spiritual and emotional needs are not being acknowledged and met. And I think, as Mike was saying, there's something about this time in your life when you know the end is near, where you really want to make sense of what's happening, and especially in relation to your myths, your belief systems, your whole life story, what could be also described as the non-visible or the sacred world, that whatever that means to you, and how those kind of thoughts and experiences and realizations need to be compassionately affirmed and valued by the people around them who are delivering the healthcare. But we just don't know how to have these kind of conversations. We're not very good at it. Maybe Mike and I can talk about it later. Mike is a chaplain. Often it's, hived off into that department. But really, and Janki Foundation definitely stands for this, and it's something I've felt passionately for a long time, is that healthcare really does involve the spiritual care of people to help them find in their search for meaning and hope, and especially when they're faced with these challenges of loss and grief, uncertainty, death. Because dying can be a highly stressful time and full of anxiety and fear, and it really requires a great deal of sensitivity and the ability to recognize what's going on for this person, and certainly not imposing your own belief system. That my own experience has really taught me that everyone dies in a totally unique way according to that story they have, as Mike said. And you really have to tune into what that story is for them, so that you're not thinking in your own mind, they've got to have this kind of death, according to me. But you're really sensitive to what are those spiritual needs and questions that they have, and how can I sensitively respond to them. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to discuss these areas and help people to be more aware. And really one of the things that kicked off this whole topic for me was Peter Fennick, who is a neuropsychiatrist who I've known for many years, and he was giving a talk at a conference and on near-death experiences and things like that. And I listened to it and I thought, my goodness, he has made that sound just like an awfully big adventure. I'd never heard such a kind of upbeat lecture about dying, and I thought everyone has to hear this. So we did invite him to come to one of our Shining Light on Death conferences, and his talk is up on our website, and I'd really encourage you to go and look at that, because it's really full of interesting information. And so I'm very grateful to his work, and he was so interested in the phenomenon around dying that he did some research, and he was particularly interested in end-of-life experiences, which he's published in actually 10 years ago now in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Care in 2010. And what he was describing were things that were happening to people around the time of death, which they were able to notice and collect in terms of data. And the things that he was aware of was something that people have deathbed visions, so that sense that someone is coming to take them to another world. So it gave them a feeling of hope and also a sense of accompaniment, that someone is there, a kind of invisible presence, often of a loved one who's predeceased them. The other phenomenon was deathbed coincidences. And I remember this too. I remember very close family friend of ours, when her husband died, and they were quite an elderly couple, she said that night that he died, she woke up and the whole room was full of light, and she just knew he was there, his presence was there. She had no previous understanding of this. She just wanted to tell me this thing had happened to her and wanted me to try and explain it to her. So these deathbed coincidences, where people have a very strong sense of connection to someone who's transitioning. And these and nearing death awareness, so that feeling that, yeah, the end is coming and I'm preparing myself for a journey and to move to another place, another existence. And I think a quote from his paper which really struck me was this feeling that the human need for connection, loving acceptance, and compassion is just as big at the end of life as it is in the beginning. So if you think of what a baby needs for nurturing and growth, and we need those same things. So it's a very tender moment, this passing on moment, and it's a very sacred moment, but it's to really enable ourselves and others to have a natural closing of this cycle of life, I think is really fundamental. And so the vision that we really need to have on people who are passing on is one of openness and acceptance and experience, really, of that person's experience and of their relatives. We all need to have that. And another phenomenon he describes is this idea of terminal lucidity. And I've seen that myself too, where people, because I'd worked with old age, so I saw people with Alzheimer's and people who've been in nursing home for years. And there was sometimes this time when they just sort of suddenly woke up. And it's a real moment of clarity before death. And to me, how I understood this was, it was like the soul was coming into awareness of itself, that it wasn't just this body, that it was really about to pass on and it wasn't being held down by this body in any sense. And I think for me in my own spiritual journey, this sense of being a soul has been so fundamental. And in my own practice, this idea, we talk about dying as, you know, a good death would be like pulling a hair through soft butter. So that sense of that energy, that point of light, that personality that I am is inhabiting this physical body, but it's something different. And I'd quite like to, I'm going to read you a poem now, as Mike has set that agenda. And this poem I read at my own mother's funeral, and it was very profound because even though I have a deep spiritual understanding and experience of myself as a soul, I feel it's not something I can impose on others, and my own family, you know, all have their own beliefs. But the actual vicar who was running the service gave me a selection of poems, and this one stood out. And as I read it, or before I read it, I said, let's all remember the soul of Mary, my mother, and send her our love. And this is part 2 from Cahill Gilbrand's The Beauty of Death, and it's called The Ascending. And what I love about it is, for me, it really captures that feeling of being a soul. I have passed a mountain peak, and my soul is soaring in the firmament of complete and unbound freedom. I am far, far away, my companions, and the clouds are hiding the hills from my eyes. The valleys are becoming flooded with an ocean of silence. And the hands of oblivion are engulfing the roads and the houses. The prairies and the fields are disappearing behind a white spectre that looks like a spring cloud, yellow as the candlelight and red as the twilight. The songs of the waves and the hymns of the streams are scattered, and the voices of throngs reduced to silence. And I can hear naught but the music of eternity, in exact harmony with the Spirit's desires. I am cloaked in full whiteness. I am in comfort. I am in peace. And for me, that experience really is something that I've learnt in meditation, when I take myself, my thoughts, to a place beyond, a place of silence, a place of stillness, where I can connect with a divine energy, a peaceful energy. And so, because I'm used to doing that, and I've had friends who are meditators who've had cancer and died, and I remember one friend, Leslie, going around to her house every day for weeks before she actually left. And we just practiced that. We practiced her leaving the body. We did meditation every night, so that that journey leaving the body was not a fearful thing for her. It wasn't an unfamiliar thing. And so I know for myself, when I've sat with others, whatever their belief system, and as Mike said, some people may think it's the end, or they may feel they're going somewhere else. But I felt that my own ability to not be afraid, my own sense that it's going to be okay, my own real deep experience of a universe, a God that loves me and that's not hostile, means that I'm really able to be present and just hold that space. And so I feel that we don't want the people passing to have to carry our fear with them. You know, we really need to be there as peaceful beings, and knowing that it's okay, you know, that their soul continues, they are leaving one body, they're going somewhere else, and that this is a totally natural phenomenon. And so I feel that that ability just to be present and give those vibrations of love and compassion and safety as someone is on this journey of death is one of the greatest gifts we could give them. And so I think they were the thoughts that I had when I was thinking about this, about being with others, being a healthcare practitioner, being with others, and also my own spiritual journey and what it's taught me. And recently here in the Janki Foundation, we've had a soul, Craig Brown, who was very dear to us, and he had cancer, and I watched in him a soul who really took control of his own dying process. He knew how he wanted to go, where he wanted to go, and he did the meditation and worked through his fear and distress, because that's going to show up too. It's not easy. It's not an easy letting go, but it was very impressive to see someone do it so awake and so conscious, and with the energy that he wanted to go with. So I would wish that for myself as well, and all of us, if we have that opportunity. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now, because I think that's my time. Huh?
Thank you, Sarah. So just a moment to just reflect on what Sarah has said. Okay, so thank you all. I just want to, before I invite Sarah and Mike to have a conversation, just to pick up a few things, just, you know, Mike, as you were talking, and you mentioned about, you know, the story of the soul and the immortality of the soul, and I hope maybe you all can touch on that in your conversation. And you mentioned about what is the story, do I tell myself, the reflection of, you know, one's life and where you're at. And then you looked at this thing about myth and poetry, which I'm very interested in. So that's a whole day. We need to have another day exploring that. But you said it's like a language and articulating profound depth. And I just listening to you read that poem, and Sarah, you reading that one you said you read when your mom passed away, you can feel, you know, the depth of those words. And Sarah, you mentioned a lot about this, the sacred, the non-visible, and looking at belief systems, and everyone dies in a different way. That's very interesting and intriguing, because it's nice to know that, you know, you can choose your own way based on your own experience, and you can create that good death you talk about. So you also mentioned about you know, the natural closing of the cycle of life, and I think that puts us in a nice space for our workshop next week, when we're exploring, you know, deeper aspects of this topic. So I'd like to invite both you and Mike to have a conversation, and you decide who speaking first, because the mic, whoever decides to speak first, your picture will come up. So I'll leave that up to you. So over to you for about 15 minutes conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Well, could I just pick up something Sarah was saying, and really, I just think it's so important, and it's about what you were saying about being present, really, you know, with someone who's going through that ending, that transitional phase, and how important it is just to be fully open and present for them. And I think, and I'm sure most people who, you know, work at the end of life with people will have done a lot of work on themselves one way or another, because I think in order to be fully present in those situations, to some degree, I think you have to come to some understanding of what your own story is, and maybe have dealt with some of your own fears and deep questions as well. So it always seemed to me such a privilege to be with people at that point in their lives. Yeah, for different reasons, to be honest. I mean, there have been moments, I think, when I've been in similar situations where you've actually felt such a depth of the presence of another, call it God if you want, but something quite profound. And I've sometimes felt that, you know, the main function of the accompanier, the health carer in that situation, is simply one of just beingness. You know, it's almost as though you are enabling the soul who's on the journey to you know, to make the necessary adjustments. This is where language fails, of course, isn't it?
Mm.
But you know, you can almost think in terms of needing to change the frequency. And I think the Tibetans are much better on this than we are, with the talk of the bardos and the different characteristics of this approach to death and beyond death, and how important it is even to continue that accompanying beyond death. Because the soul is still in the transitional phase and still able to make choices to be attracted in this direction or that direction and so on. But yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, and it's kind of connected, but someone shared with me a video recently, and I was just watching it today, about a woman, you may have heard of this, who can communicate with animals. And it was really fascinating watching her, and you could sense that she was just connecting with the energy of that being, and she was saying that, and she could pick up what was going on for them and communicate back to the humans what was going on for them. And this sense of that words in some ways are very clumsy, you know, they're a kind of an approximation to really what's going on with our feelings and the energy in the room. And you could see she had somehow finally attuned herself to the energy of animals, and so really did understand them. And I feel it's a similar process that's going on and I really experienced this a lot with people with dementia, that, you know, their language skills had gone. So how was I going to connect with them? How was I going to communicate with them? And it is through a feeling of an energetic connection, and the more aware you are of that, of what's the vibration you're putting out, really, and that almost people with where their language skills are diminished, and I think people have also noted this around people who are dying, their other senses can be very heightened, and to be aware of this. And we did have a soul midwife speak at one of our talks, and she gave a fascinating, and she's also on our website, Anne Yeomans. She gave a fascinating description of, as the elements are leaving, you know, what are the best practices that kind of help facilitate that transition as the soul energy is withdrawing from the body. So there are people who are much more finely attuned to this invisible energy, this soul energy, and can help work with it in a way that, I mean, I'm thinking of some of the care homes that I worked in, and it was really, as you say, for them to be able to be in this profession, but it was the sort of almost less trained, but motherly and worldly wise ladies who could be there with the people who were passing on, and they had a deep faith themselves, and how that helped them to be present in that situation, and how reassuring it was for the relatives and people around, just to know there were people who weren't being rattled by this natural ending of life. But you know, what's the work that we do on ourselves? You know, as a chaplain, what do you feel as? Do you get called to the bedside? Are you present, as it were, for when people are moving on? What do you feel helps you to be there and to be present?
Well, I mean, most of my work is in mental health. It does happen, of course, that, you know, we are accompanying people in the final stages. It's not quite the same as working in general hospitals. However, I do find in any sort of deep sort of pastoral need, a situation where, you know, people are in deep need, deep crisis, transition, whatever it is, that one is just drawn into a space. I think it's an intuitive response that arises, you know, through experience and over time. It's certainly, I think, comfortableness isn't quite the right word, but it is something about being able just to be in that space without feeling the need to say things or to do anything than other, you know, hold in some way the person, you know, that you're with. Yeah, I suppose at those moments, you know, there are certain, I suppose, images and metaphors that speak to me, like, you know, that you're passing over, you're enabling someone to go from one dimension to another, from one set of arms and hands to another set of arms, whatever it is. But I think holding that sort of image just allows you just to be there, attentive. I think that's so important. You know, it is, you know, with intention and attentive. But I'm not sure I could characterize it much more than that, really. It's a quality of presence, isn't it? But I think it comes back to what you were hinting at just at the end of what you said there, and it's something about you know, the language of that sort of certain people accompanying people at the end of their lives and so on. It's not something which we've heard a lot about in our culture until fairly recently. I'm sure there have been people around all the time, but nevertheless, you know, in the whole business perhaps of death not being talked about, it's simply been, you know, left out of the discourse, out of being talked about at all. But now we are doing, and it does suggest to me that something is, you know, quite significant is afoot culturally. And alongside that, I think is the other really important thing is that the more we can talk about death like this, the more I think it opens up the discussion of our own responsibilities, I suppose, for our own spiritual development. That we can do a fair bit to prepare ourselves for the celestial transfer way upstream or downstream before we actually get into the last act. And part of that, you know, we're seeing all the time, as you know, for example, the whole mindfulness thing and the New Age thing, whatever it is, but a greater readiness of people to talk the language of spirituality, to explore, to not see themselves as fixed and given, to see themselves as being in a process of spiritual growth and development and so on. And I think that, you know, opens a lot of doors and possibilities in terms of, you know, recognizing our approaches to death as something that we can, through the course of life, actually, prepare ourselves better or worse for. I've always been very interested in, you know, the way that older cultures have sort of dealt with this sort of thing, and going right back to ancient Greece, fascinated by the mystery religions there, and what seems to have happened at Eleusis and some of those other great sort of initiatory experiences, were that people were literally taken through their own death before they died, i.e. they experienced the death of this little ego, you know, what we identify with as being me, and somehow had an experience of something much greater than that, that allowed them then to approach death when it came in a very different sort of way. And so I do think there are, you know, some really important questions there about how different cultures sort of can make it harder, as it were, to deal with the inevitable. Yeah.
How, I mean, yes, our culture is, I think this COVID thing has really highlighted the shock of everyone that with so many people leaving so quickly. And I think we've been talking about the situation where people, I guess if you have cancer or some kind of illness or some kind of understanding that you might be going soon, that's one thing. But for all of us, you know, and especially for younger people, when, you know, they're well one day and gone the next, it's the need to have prepared yourself for the unexpected. It becomes even more pressing, really, and that sense that we can't somehow imagine that our death is way off in the future, but it could be tomorrow, and that how prepared am I, you know, to let go, and the practices. I think you're saying, you know, the culture now of trying to live each day in with a feeling of compassion for yourself and others, but not doing things that you'll regret or you'll need to say sorry for. But all these kind of issues that come up around the end, when you feel it's the end, and they say the things you need to say, you know, I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, just the important things that we want to clear up. But maybe some of these practices that are becoming more culturally acceptable means that we're doing them more frequently as we go along, rather than storing them all up, all that unfinished business, storing it all up to the end, and that hopefully will help us let go more easily.
Yes, I think what you say also points, clearly what is going to be a major problem, I think, for many people, in that they've not been able, because of the nature of the way people have died in this epidemic, to be able to say those things. They've not been able to accompany people at the end of their lives, family I'm talking about, or have the opportunity to say those things, as people have been in a ventilator situation or been completely isolated and so on. So the normal sorts of, if you like, rituals of saying those sorts of things and so on have been denied people. And one can only guess that that's very likely to make coming to terms with loss really quite difficult for many people. Because, we do surround dying and death with a lot of sort of rituals, the obvious rituals around ceremonies and memorials and all of those sorts of things. But when that's not able to happen, when the larger family isn't able to gather together, maybe just a handful of people to say goodbye, all of those sorts of things, I do think it's going to make it harder for a lot of people. It's hard to know just how it so goes against the grain, doesn't it, of what's been built up culturally over a long time, the way the rituals around dying and death and grieving and support and everything else, that horse and cart has been driven through them. And
I think, I went to I attended one virtual funeral for someone who died from COVID, and her husband and children were there, and maybe one or two other people. But it was pretty tough. It was pretty tough to see what they were going through. They were so brave. But also the kind of starkness of it, as you say, the support of the rituals wasn't there, and it just struck me at that point how even more important, in a way, the giving of that subtle love, really sending mental energy to them, sending mental energy to her, spiritual energy, that really focused my meditation, if you like, because I couldn't be there physically. It's like I really had to be there present, spiritually or in another way. And again, to be able to do that, to be able to focus your mind and to send that amount of love and peaceful energy and reassuring energy is a practice. And it's a practice that, you can develop through the practice of meditation and other things. But I think they're going to become more and more important too, as the more physical ways that we can contain and express and support people, and I guess it must be the same in war. You see people living in circumstances in the world now and dying in circumstances in the world now, which are just very, very moving, upsetting, and you can see they don't have that, though they don't have the infrastructure to even have those normal rituals that would help them grieve. So I think our hearts and minds have to really be, to me, really connecting to that source of love in the universe and directing it towards people who are suffering in this way, because I think this untimely death, as they call it, it's a bit of an epidemic of that for all kinds of reasons, and you feel it in the world. So I think that's where our spiritual hearts have to open and really be sending energy to people on this level.
Can I just ask you to pause there, and maybe we can open up if anyone has any questions. So if you do have any questions, if you can write them in the chat. In the meantime, I want to show you why people are getting their thoughts together. I just have a couple of quotations that maybe can set off questions and for you to maybe comment on. So if those 2 slides can go up. So this one is saying, life asked that, why do people love me and hate you? And that responded, because you're a beautiful lie and I'm a painful truth. And this, Mike, it resonated what you said about, you know, that small ego. And the other slide is a quotation from Rumi, and it says, do not stand at my grave and forever cry, I am not there, I did not die. So while we're getting the questions, if anyone wants to ask any questions in the chat box, perhaps maybe you can reflect on these 2 quotations and what it means to you, maybe from a personal perspective. So you'll want to comment on those?
It would be very nice to have some comments or questions from people in the chat box. So please be brave and interact with us. We'd really like that. And we've allowed this time. Or even your own experiences of what you've been through or what you're going through. It would be very nice to have that interaction.
So there is one here. How to cope with loss of a dear one. Is it attachment to the person in your life? So that's one for now. So how to cope with loss of a dear one. Is it attachment to the person in your life?
I mean, I might take this opportunity to point out that tomorrow, I don't know if you were going to mention this, Nirmala, as well, but we are also, Janki Foundation is doing a seminar on bereavement and grief. So I'm really hoping that subject's going to be explored by that panel in a lot more depth in terms of really all the things that you go through when someone close to you dies, because it's a deep subject, and I think grief and loss, it's much more complex than to just say, oh, if I'm feeling pain then I must be attached and that's a bad thing or something like that. I feel that if someone's been important in your life and you have been close to them, you are going to feel a gap when they're no longer in that form. But I think you certainly can still connect with them, like that sense in the church with my mother. And someone came up to me after that and said, that was beautiful how you asked us all to send our love to her at that moment and how it connected us. And so that feeling that you can still be connected, because that, as that quote says, the soul hasn't died, the soul continues, and the soul will still receive your love. The soul will still receive your good wishes. The soul will still receive, you know, thoughts, peaceful thoughts, healing thoughts from you. So even though they've, and there's another poem, isn't there? I haven't gone, I'm just in the next room, or something like that. I can't remember who wrote that, but that sense that, you know, spiritually and mentally, you can still be in connection. And so do you really want to be sending energy to that soul of your grief, of your pain, of your fear? I mean, you will have to deal with that yourself, but actually there is something you can do in terms of still connecting with that person.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. There are 3 more questions here, so shall I just read them all out and then maybe you all can decide who...
Unless Mike wants to say anything to
Mike,
that?
do you want to add to what Sarah was saying? Because there's also a request, Mike, that if you can reread the Thomas Merton quotation. So I don't know if that's something you might want to do.
Well, I can do that, certainly. It was just to say, no, just to endorse really what Sarah said there. I think, but clearly, I think for many people, it is a spiritual crisis that they're plunged into, isn't it? The loss of somebody close. And yes, attachment is a very sort of complex subject, but I do think, we can motor along in life with a set of beliefs that aren't particularly tested or challenged or necessarily developed. They can be closer to the sentimental end of the spectrum rather than to reality. And I think it's, when we do find ourselves in situations of loss, that what we most deeply believe, it comes to the surface really. And so, yeah, if and again, it's to do, I think, with the work we've done on ourselves prior to these experiences. It just, how we then negotiate the loss of somebody close, I think, is very different. And sometimes we have an awful lot of catching up to do and a lot of work to do in a very short time. And it can be, tremendously disturbing, I think, for people. Because
Mike,
sometimes, yeah, sorry.
adding to what you've just said, there's a question relating to that, so maybe I can read that. And it says, can I really send good energy when in a loss of feeling? So can I really send good energy when I'm feeling lost or in that feeling of maybe being low? I guess that's what they're saying.
Well, I don't think that's an easy thing to do, is it?
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that I've often talked to people about, is being true to their feelings. People, when there's loss, can feel very angry with the universe, with God, with the doctors, with the nurses, with the chaplain, all that sort of thing. I think there's no point sugarcoating those sorts of feelings. You have to recognize that those feelings are there. If you have a belief, a faith, if you have a sort of spiritual anchorage, I think you can always, address that, can't you? And say, well, these are my feelings right now. I know, however, that there is a bigger picture, there is a deeper picture. I cannot quite access it now, but you, the universe, God, please help me reconstellate myself, because, it's something like that. I think it's a time of great integrity. It's a time of potentially huge spiritual movement in ourselves, but always integrity, honesty to our feelings. It's fundamental to all of that. And yes, we may not be in a position just to radiate love, to those who are moving on at that moment, but our intention is to do that. And I believe that our intentions are really recognized by the higher powers. So,
Thank you, Mike. Sarah, I'll ask you to comment on that, but I thought I'll read this question, maybe if you want to also give your views on it. So it says, how would you support someone through end of life who doesn't have a religious or spiritual practice or belief system?
I think like both Mike and I have said, you need to really be sensitive to what gives their life meaning and purpose. What is significant to them, and so what's their life story? And it may be a football club, or it might be nature, or it might be their pussycat, or it might be their grandchildren. But in a sense, if you have an opportunity to, and you know someone, I mean, last year we lost my nephew's wife, and we went to sit with her, and I was, totally spiritually available to give her support, to meditate, to do all the bells and whistles stuff. But what she really, really wanted to do was show me on her phone the jewelry that she'd made in her life. And she made beautiful earrings and necklaces and bracelets. And I just had to let go of any idea I had of what I was there to be and to offer, and enter into her world. And her world was really showing me, you know, her creativity, and that's how we connected. So I think the spirituality is about connecting with people, and it's about showing your compassion and your sensitivity and your presence by entering into their world and what's important and significant to them, not what, which could be anything.
Mike, do you want to add anything to that from your role as
Again, only to endorse what Sarah's saying. I mean, I think it's one of the cardinal tenets of psychotherapy to find a common language. If that language is football, let's talk football as much as one can muster it in oneself. But if it's cake decorating, that's what it is, because, you know, that's the language, that's the way to connect. And other things are possible once you're connected, but if you're not connected, then not a great deal is possible.
Someone posted, as a chaplain, sometimes I do have to hold that space when someone is leaving, just a thought. So we sort of cover that. There was also someone who said in their comment that the Rumi phrase is very true. And they shared their experience that they died at age 14 and had a life review, then came back.
Wow.
And since then they have worked with the spirit world for many years, where some visit for the living and some are still stuck on the earth plane, where I have to send them over as they are scared of the white light. I am not scared of that. Again, everyone dies differently, and Sarah is very aware of this. So if you both want to comment on anything, or shall I just go down and read some more?
Yeah, I just had a thought with the previous question about, you know, when your energy's low and,
Yes.
and what can you send to someone. And I remember a situation, it wasn't a death, but it was the loss of a significant relationship. And I felt very, very low indeed. And I could reframe it in my mind, you know, that sense of and I think grief it's a roller coaster ride, really, and you just have to, it's a white knuckle ride sometimes, you just have to hang on. But that sense of, I could reframe it that I was just going to be quiet or peaceful, you know. So it's not like you have to send all this fantastic high energy to someone. It can just be very quiet, very peaceful, something very simple. And find the level that, as Mike said, feels true for you, feels authentic. You're not pretending, so you've got to find something that really is your truth, and try and stay with that.
So there's another comment here. It says, a Hindu friend used to say good night with the words, "Are you ready to die?" How can we get people to reflect on the only certainty is that we will die? I have been forced to accept this for 60 years. Towards the end of my husband's life, we practiced the words, never apart, just a thought away.
Lovely. Very sweet.
And then there's another comment about explaining to the patient so that there is life after this one, and it is a lovely place. But I guess what you said about respecting people's beliefs is important. So there's another question here. So
just one point on that, which is quite important, I think, is that I think, you know, when people don't have their own beliefs, it can actually be quite empowering that there are people around them who do have a very sort of strong sense of, you know, a bigger picture and of a more positive story, if you like. They can, I think, derive something from that. We don't put that onto them. We don't try to sell them it, but we're holding it for them. We're holding, you know, meaning, hope. These are energies. We're holding these things in this theatre. We're holding them for them, yeah. And I think they can tap into that.
I'd like one more question to you both, and this one says, can I ask you about when someone is really battling against dying? A friend of mine really didn't go in an easy way. She argued and struggled against it right to the end. And then another question, my brother was a non-believer, and I have had spirit come through who are totally shocked what they find. I'm not quite sure. If you want maybe the first bit as they're coming, I'm reading.
Yeah.
So what about those who struggle and don't accept it? Maybe your thoughts, and because I think we'll need to sum
We
up.
need to finish, we do,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, it's interesting, in my reading before today, it was looking at, you know, there's a paper that's been written about how much pain and suffering and denial do people go through when they're dying, and they sort of really charted the whole thing and noted that denial can be a coping strategy that can be beneficial and support people with unfinished business. So I think it's not saying, you know, there will be periods in the whole dying process where people, if they're aware of that something's going on, where they will resist, or they will feel anxious, or they will feel afraid. And I've certainly known deeply spiritual people who've been in complete denial that they're about to leave. So I think having a spiritual practice and belief doesn't necessarily prepare you for dying either. So it's what I mean. It's a totally unique journey, this one. And again, my sense was that, and the research backs this up, that your acceptance of what's going on enables you to have a more peaceful death. And but that this dying process is very unpredictable, and there are phases or transitions, and sometimes people are fighting, and then something happens. So you could say that's kind of ego-based, and then something happens and they let go of it, and then they go into a much more peaceful phase. And that actually apparently happens to the majority of people, that even though you might go through these phases of pain or denial or fear, that by the end most people have a peaceful death. But it's not 100% guaranteed, that's for sure.
Thank you. Mike, you want to add anything before I
No, I think it's as Sarah was saying, I think it's unique to everybody, this situation. I've known, on the other hand, people who've been given a serious diagnosis and have given up on life and died prematurely, and you know, and missed opportunities, I think, for what was possible in the final stage of life, really. So I can totally understand, you know, why some people do fight, and it's absolutely necessary. And I do think also, yes, there comes a point, you know, of a balance. Something shifts deep in the heart, in the soul, and you know, there is, I think, in most cases, that move towards acceptance at the end. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so that we'll have to stop there for today, but as this is next Saturday, and we're exploring the spiritual dimension to the end of life. So that's the theme of the workshop, and how it will be structured. We will have small breakout rooms with facilitators, you know, with small groups, you know, discussing and sharing on some questions based on what the speakers have shared today. Mike and Sarah, many thanks for sharing from your own personal experience. And I just realized this, how deep, you know, what you've shared, both have shared. You know, we can create more workshops on certain things that you've mentioned. And a special thanks to Manish, who's in the background doing all the technical bits. So thanks for that. And for all those who've contributed to creating the event and for next week. And all those who've attended and stayed on. I know we had at one time 79 people, but some have had to leave. So thank you for staying on. So if you choose to stay on for the meditation, I'd like to invite you to do that. And Sarah, I'll hand over to you to take us through a closing meditation.
So I'm just going to use my little bowl, give us a little sound to take us into silence. So sitting comfortably and just taking a few deep breaths. Just bringing myself into this present moment by noticing, am I holding on to any tension in my body? Just breathing in peace and kindness to any part of me that's feeling tense or stressed. And as I breathe out, letting that tension go. Just connecting with that gentle ebb and flow of my breathing. Noticing the soothing, comforting rhythm of just breathing in and breathing out. And as I come closer in, noticing that I may be having thoughts going through my mind, I just watch them as an observer. Thoughts going in and going out. As if I'm standing on a riverbed and just watching the water flowing past. And any feelings that are arising. Noticing them, acknowledging them. But dropping deeper still beneath my thoughts and feelings into an energy of peace, of stillness, of calm. Of silence. And as I am present here in my own inner safe place of quiet, I become aware of my own true qualities of love and kindness and peace. And I may be aware of a presence, the universal energy of love, a benevolent presence that is protecting me and guiding me. And I feel held by this love. And it resonates with my own deepest truth. I am that point, that diamond, that eternal star. There is nothing to fear. And I just let go and flow into that ocean of love. then gradually coming back into the awareness of my breath and my body and this present moment. Opening my eyes